Thank you, Natasha. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, distinguished guests. As you heard, I'm Stan Meissner. I'm a songwriter. I'm a recovering recording artist from the 80s. And I have the pleasure to serve as the president of the board of directors of SOCAN. On behalf of SOCAN, we're pleased to be co-sponsor of this event, along with our friends at Music Canada, and it's my pleasure to open with some very brief remarks. In case you aren't aware, SOCAN is a member-based organization that represents nearly 150,000 songwriters, composers, and music publishers collecting and distributing royalties for the use of their works in Canada and around the world. On the flip side, we license more than 130,000 businesses from coast to coast to coast and allow them to play music legally and ethically on their services and in their establishments. As you know well, music plays a very important part in the cultural fabric of Canada, but it's also vital to the Canadian economy. Live and recorded performances constitute an integral part of everyday life for Canadians, from the radio stations and internet streaming services that play our favorite hits, the soundtracks to movies and television programs we watch, the mega concerts we attend in huge arenas, to the local bars that we enjoy a drink or a meal at and hear music. Looking after all of that and ensuring that songwriters, composers, and music publishers get paid for those uses of music, that's what SOCAN does. I'm sure it comes as no surprise to anyone here that SOCAN, along with all of our members, music industry associations, arts and culture partners, and everyone in this room, we've all been at the epicenter of the massive change in our music and cultural industries, where the digital environment has uprooted everything about the way we do and the way we think about the business of music and other creative arts. We live in an incredible time. Never before have so many been able to access so much wonderful music, and never before have creators been able to access so easily a global audience. So what's the problem? As hard as it is to be successful in the music business, and trust me, it's hard. In the old paradigm, a songwriter, a million sales of a record would earn a songwriter a middle-class living. Now, 1 million streams will buy you a pizza, but you'd better hold the pepperoni. If that weren't so distasteful, the recent decision of the Copyright Board of Canada to reduce royalty rates for music streaming services was beyond disappointing. SOCAN has passionately appealed that decision, and we remain steadfast in our mission to protect the value of the rights of music creators. Not the least of the problems we face, and this is really on a global and industry-wide scale, is the value gap or safe harbor. Basically, this is where big companies like Google, YouTube, Facebook, and even Bell and Rogers are making fortunes of money utilizing our content, a word I generally don't love when talking about music, but still, very little of that money flows back to the creators. I just returned from an International Council of Creators meeting, which was held in Tokyo, with songwriters and composers from all over the world, where it was clear that the value gap is probably the single most challenging issue that we have to deal with as we try to embrace this brave new world. There is more money than has likely ever existed in all of our creative industries combined being earned by these companies, and so little of it is being paid to creators. It's really shameful. So what can we do? Well, for a start, Canada last revised its Copyright Act with the Copyright Modernization Act amendments in 2012. That act tried to address what we then believed to be the current realities of the digital world. Now, 5 years later, a mandated review of the Copyright Act is about to take place. Well, Spotify and Google didn't come to Canada till 2014. Apple Music and Tidal didn't even exist until 2015. Netflix is almost in every home. YouTube has exploded to be a vast galaxy of content. A lot changes in 5 years. We urge the government to work with us all in ensuring that the next revision helps put us back on track with fair and equitable treatment, and most importantly, fair payment for the use of our music and other digital content on all platforms, for right now, and with technologically neutral ideas that will help us as we look forward and try to anticipate a future that we can barely imagine. Okay, so moving on to a more immediate future. Our speakers and panelists today are about to enlighten you about some of the realities of the lives we currently face as creators. And to start things off, I'd like to welcome our first guest. Miranda Mulholland, who is of course a member of SOCAN, is an incredibly versatile vocalist, instrumentalist, and performer. She's opened a record label, started a music festival, has toured Europe and North America extensively, and made guest appearances on more than 50 albums. But in addition to all of that, she's a fierce advocate for the rights of music creators, and for that we can all be grateful. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Miranda Mulholland.
I've only done this once before, and my mother said, "That was great, Miranda, but you could go a little slower." So I'll endeavor to go just slow enough for my mother. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to reiterate some of these sentiments that were already said, and I hope you understand that this is because they are important and it's pressing, and now is the time to make change. I'd like to take this opportunity to observe an extremely important anniversary in the lives of creators. On November 7th, 2012, just over 5 years ago, the Copyright Modernization Act came into force, and it wasn't perfect. In fact, it probably created as many problems for creators as it solved, but it was a landmark. The government understood that there would need to be changes made, so they included in the act a specific provision that it required a review. And when was that supposed to happen? 5 years after the day on which the act came into force. So that was 2 weeks ago. And so far, nothing concrete. I find this disappointing. During the last 2 years, I have had a few opportunities to speak with Canadian Heritage Minister Mélanie Joly. And she told me on both occasions that artists need to speak up. And I told her of my reluctance to criticize the hand that feeds you, even though they're only feeding you morsels. But she only reiterated that we need to speak up. Those conversations led directly to the founding of Focus on Creators, over 3,500 creators strong, tirelessly advocating for change and ready to support the minister at a moment's notice. And a lot of people dedicated a lot of time to this to make this a success, including John Deegan, who's here today. I was honored to be given the podium at the Economic Club in May to give this speech about the lives of creators in this digital age. And I was thrilled to hear that some of these issues I addressed were brought up in the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage by Member of Parliament Julie de Bruzen, who's also here today. Thank you so much for that. But I'm aware that there hasn't been any tangible change. I'm also aware that there's increased funding for granting and export, but the main message of creators and what we're trying to say is that we want a functioning marketplace right here at home. We're here and we're speaking up, and we'd love to be heard. Now, a year ago, Music Canada President Graham Henderson delivered a speech at the Economic Club in Toronto, which he called "The Broken Promise of a Golden Age." Graham's speech addressed the social contract made in the late 90s that reflected a repeated prediction. In a digital world, with rules that help fuel technology companies' growth, creators would be better off and playing fields would be leveled. Instead of a new golden age, artists have experienced a sharp erosion of their rights, along with their ability to earn a living from their creative works and participate in a viable marketplace. What Graham was describing is what we call the value gap, and it's being recognized as the root of the problem around the world. So 6 months later, when I was asked to speak about my experiences and how my life and the lives of my friends look these days, I was quite unprepared for the reaction. A lot of people were fairly surprised at the current state of the music industry and what the realities are for a musician who's not a household name. I realize that, but not a beginner. I have 17 years of experience professionally performing and a career that's included a lot of recognizable works and collaborations, and I still have trouble making a living. So here are the Coles notes. I know you got a little brief intro, but I studied opera, performance at Western and then at McGill, and I'm really excited about my duo that I have with Andrew Penner called Harrow Fair and the boutique record label that I run. But for 7 years, I was a member of Great Lakes Swimmers. I've played with Jim Cuddy, Stephen Page, Calexico, Alan Doyle, Dan Mangan, Joel Plaskett, and played and sung on hundreds of songs by many different artists, including Cowboy Junkies, Donovan Woods, Rose Cousins, as well as my own records. Most of those people are SOCAN members as well. I do a lot of studio work for film and television. I performed all the fiddle for the CBC hit TV show Republic of Doyle, and recently the film Maudie about Nova Scotia folk artist Maud Lewis. I founded and I'm the artistic director of a new festival in the Muskoka town of Gravenhurst that launched in August with 23 bands, 3 days of programming, and capping it off with our brilliant headliner Jim Cuddy and his sons. I'm also a member of Soul Pepper Theatre Company, and we just brought 13 original Canadian productions down to New York City this past July at the beautiful Signature Theatre on 42nd Street. I'm also a member of the Board of Governors of Massey Roy Thompson Hall. So I'm sorry about the laundry list, but I just wanted to get my point across, which is that even though I do all of that, I have a lot of hats, hopefully very stylish. But I have a serious problem. My problem is that because of this broken promise of a golden age, I'm barely able to make a living and live in the city that I need to live in order to work. Now, when artists bring their concerns to policymakers, the response that we're given, and I've heard this personally, is that creators are asking for the clock to be turned back, and they're not going to do that. But that's not what we want. However, we do need to look back at the policies and promises that were made in the late 90s and recognize that times have changed. My MySpace page doesn't work anymore. If anything, we'd like to turn the clock forward and rethink some of these ideas and assumptions that have turned out to be false and predictions that have sadly not come to pass. Every time the subject of the digital revolution comes up, the main solution creators are offered is adapt. There are some adaptations we have power over and some that we don't. Artists are told that part of our income should be from CDs sold off the stage. But I run a record label and I couldn't even buy a MacBook with a disk drive. And the only place that I can play a CD is in my '98 Corolla. So we have to adapt to the new ways of accessing music and advertising our art. Now, we were promised that the digital age would level the playing field by eliminating middlemen. Now, as an indie musician, and I'm sure that a lot of the indie musicians in this room can attest to, I upload my tour dates on my website, Facebook, Bands in Town, Twitter, Instagram, and Factor. I report and update my neighboring rights claims to ACTRA, and I manage my creative catalog with Resound. I report my shows and set lists on SOCAN. I pay to report my sales on @Venue, use SoundCloud for private streams from media, YouTube to upload my content before someone else does, and I pay a percentage of my income to my distributor to get my music online and in stores. I'm a data entry clerk. Far from disappearing, the middleman has multiplied. Worse yet for the artists, it's an overwhelming amount of activity and does not leave much time to do the actual creating. To add insult to injury, in 2014, a senior manager at Google Canada provided his opinion on this to the Parliament Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. He said, "The challenge is that the skills that are required to succeed have radically changed. Some are doing a better job at adapting than others because it's just a completely different environment they're operating in." Okay, so thank you so much for the update on my challenges that you created in this landscape and that you perpetuate. So this leads me to this word that's very important to me: accountability. Let's look at the current situation and who's accountable for the devaluation to which we're forced to adapt. We now have over a dozen competing paid subscription streaming platforms in Canada, among them Spotify, Apple Music, and Google Play. And there's over 400 legal digital services worldwide. Now picture each shiny new platform as a shop window. It's our content at fire sale prices that fills their shop window, giving them credibility, while the creators of this content are asked to do the advertising. They give us, the creators, lists of best practices to get more of our hard-won fans to use their services. So if we're not getting on enough playlists, it's our fault for not engaging with our fans enough. But in reality, it is becoming increasingly difficult for independent artists to land songs on their curated playlists. And a new middleman has emerged, the playlist pitcher, which costs quite a great deal of money. The formula is much the same on the ad-based services, except they price our work even lower. So the biggest music service in the world is YouTube. And did you know that 82% of YouTube users use it for music? It's supported by advertising, and it's based on user-uploaded content. But wait, running a commercial site based on unauthorized uploading of copyrighted music is illegal, right? So YouTube says it isn't our fault. We're just the shop window. We didn't put the items in the window, so we're not accountable for them. We're a passive intermediary. We're not liable for this massive copyright infringement. But once again, a top brass at Google just bragged that 80% of all watch time is recommended on YouTube. And he explained that everyone thinks that all the music that's being listened to and watched is by search, but it isn't. And in his words, that's a really important and powerful thing. This means that YouTube actively directs consumers. This doesn't seem all that passive to me. And there's zero accountability once more. Bless you. When asked about the problem of low payment to artists, a Google executive said this: "It's important to note that on the concerns that have been flagged, there's no consensus even amongst the artistic community about the impacts of streaming or what they actually think about it or what they don't think about it." Once again, infantilization of artists. Every single time I hear a newspaper article about the reduction in royalty rates they're getting from streaming, I'll see another artist who basically says, well, actually, my royalty rates are pretty good. Newsflash. Your rates are the lowest in the world. Your revenue is built on the backs of other people's talent and work, and you refuse to acknowledge it. Accountability means acknowledging value and compensating for it. So another solution musicians are presented with is touring. Is touring the answer? There are a lot of positives about touring, and you learn to find the bits that you enjoy and make the most of them all, but it's work. Since the devaluation of music that's occurred in this new era of free, fans are more unwilling to pay for live music, and the market is saturated with bands trying to eke out a living on the road. Touring is also difficult for many artists, and the framework doesn't exist to support some genres like hip-hop, and it's unkind to people with families, and it's unkind to women. When I was putting together the lineup for my festival, I texted a multi-Juno nominated musician friend to see if he was available. And he texted back that no, he'd been full for a long time for that weekend. And 5 minutes later, he sent me another text saying, "Oh, you mean as a musician? I thought you wanted to rent my Airbnb." He is so tired of taking his band on the road and losing money or barely scraping by with the help of grants and government funding that he set aside music making for making beds. So this is not a business model, and it's a far cry from a fair marketplace for our work. I want to discuss one of the purported benefits of the digital revolution that we're all very aware of, which is targeting. Because of the vast amount of data collected from all of us, audiences for any product, service, or creation can be precisely targeted online. You see that in your ads of what you actually just had in your cart, and they're trying to remind you to buy that. So theoretically, it's supposed to allow niche products to find their consumers. But the trouble is, niche isn't easy for artists in the digital world. Because the streaming system is built on a market share, the fraction of a cent that you get per stream decreases wildly if your music isn't in the mainstream. The less it's played, the less it finds its way into the playlist algorithms, and the less it's played again to the point that it's sometimes erased altogether. For example, quietly and with no official notice, InGrooves, which provides the back end to Fontana North Distributing, which is my distribution company for my label, they decided they would no longer upload classical music to Apple Music and iTunes, as it wasn't popular enough to be cost-effective for the data entry required. That's an entire genre of music. I find that philosophically very troubling. As much as I'd rather be writing and playing music than anything else, the truth is I haven't much to show for it besides a discography and a stack of lanyards. For a long time, I thought I just wasn't good enough, and that was very difficult, until I started being honest with other artist friends who I imagined were in a better financial spot, and it turned out it's across the board. So I've put some thoughts to that situation, and there's a beautifully made pamphlet here with an infographic on it with some of these roles that we all have to play. As artists, be as honest as you feel comfortable about your life and your lifestyle. This will help us be more honest and see the real picture. Create and protect your intellectual property. Speak up for your contributions to projects. Make your own pieces of art and do the paperwork to safeguard this art. Support robust copyright laws. They're here to protect you. There's a misconception that this is only for the big fish, but that's absolutely wrong. Now, if you're fortunate enough to have asked at any time during the last 10 years, is it really that bad? Well, congratulations, because you're in the 1%. But here's how you can pay back into the ecosystem that's disappeared since you got your break. Perhaps you're in a position to bring an opener along to your concerts or champion a young talent that you're excited about. As a consumer, there are a number of best practices that every streaming service gives to artists and labels, and they're ways that they want artists to reach out to their fan base that they have built and to plug into the system. Fair enough. Let's use it. Make it easier for your favorite artists. Here are some free ways to help. Be a tastemaker. Create playlists for events, road trips, friends' birthdays. Add your favorite artists. Download and share in a way that gets artists paid, of course. Write reviews and rate. Getting reviews and ratings for books or music or anything like this, it helps shift algorithms in favor of the artists and helps their work come up as things you might like and can give your favorite artists an edge in the very competitive granting and funding races. Now, here's some pretty cheap ways to help. If you've been going to buy a record or you've been tempted by a great track in advance of its release, buy the record on release day. This can accelerate an album onto the front page of whatever service you use to buy music, which is an excellent advertisement. Buy merchandise. Show off your band love with t-shirt, poster, tickets, go to live shows. If you love an album or a book, buy it. Buy one to give to a friend. Subscribe to a music service. For the price of one album a month, you not only get millions of songs at your fingertips with no ads, but you're also making a difference. The revenue gap between ad-based services and their subscription versions is significant. As industry members, now I wish this was a given, but respect the time it has taken for your artists to get to the point where you can help with your skills. Remember that this is an ecosystem. We need symbiosis. I recently heard an industry member say, without irony, well, where would the artist be without the industry? Well, where would the industry be without the artists? Creators are the song, and industry is the amplifier. It's a delicate balance, and we all need each other. Respect artists through clear and consistent language about compensation. In a profession where musicians are so often called upon to donate our talent for exposure or for publicity, and where our union has little clout anymore negotiating fees for the vast majority of us, be upfront about payment. Be realistic about expectations and consider carefully what you're asking of people. Be an incubator. If you can offer building opportunities for younger artists or incentives for more established artists to support the ecosystem, do it. It will benefit everyone. Now, I congratulate Massey Roy Thompson Hall on their excellent Live at Massey program, which helps grow the careers of promising artists towards the goal of performing at the Grand Dame herself. Now, they promote shows in venues of increasing size using their credibility, loyalty, and taste-making status to give these artists a platform and a chance to build an audience. A similar program has commenced at the beautifully under renovation National Arts Center, where I had the opportunity to perform last week, and we can sort of overview the renovation as we speak here. How are they doing? Pay for your tickets. These artists who are on your label, your management, your agent roster, for who you work for as a publicist, they pay you for your services through percentages or fees, so why on earth would you expect to get their work for free? If you have a company and you're in a position to redesign things, or say you're a record label building a new premises, take bold steps. Make a new company for 10 years, 20 years from now, not for right now. Now, Patagonia, which is an outdoor wear company, they opened a daycare at their offices. Now, it recovers 91% of calculable costs annually, and the benefits, financial and otherwise, pay for themselves. There are tax benefits, employee retention, greater employee loyalty, more women in management. So imagine a record company that housed a daycare, not only for its employees, but also for visiting artists on PR junkets or musicians in town recording albums. That would be a draw, not only nationally, but internationally. Imagine if more effort was made to help all women in all genres of the arts, not to make the choice between being an artist or being a parent, or being torn between those choices. If you want the executives of tomorrow, then you need affordable childcare should be a mandate for every company and for every employee. Now, what the government can do. End tech company safe harbors. The social contract that internet service providers put forward back in the 1990s was that they would provide connectivity to the world in exchange for immunity from liability when they're acting as a mere intermediary or a store window or a mere search engine. Now, the bargain was struck and the laws were drafted to create safe harbors for those early days internet companies. But over the past 10, 20 years, business models have changed And online services like YouTube actively direct consumers to music on their site that they think consumers want to hear. And so they are effectively selling artists' music. They're just not paying creators appropriately for it because they're pretending that this isn't the business model. The European Commission has now acknowledged that the market isn't functioning properly, and they have identified and accepted the problem as the unintended value gap and agreed that legal clarification is needed. Can we follow suit? End other industry cross-subsidies. The radio royalty exemption is an industry cross-subsidy given to every commercial radio station in Canada, exempting them from paying more than $100 in royalties to artists and record labels on their first $1.25 million in advertising. The exemption was introduced as a political compromise in 1997 amendments to the Copyright Act, but it's now outdated and it's unjustified, if it ever was justified, and it's really not right that these artists and labels continue to subsidize those large media companies. I am subsidizing Bell. On TV and film royalties, because composers, songwriters, and publishers receive public performance royalties when their musical works are used in soundtracks of TV and film, one would think that the performers and the record labels would afford the same right to compensation. But not in Canada. The definition of sound recording in the Copyright Act is worded in such a way that recorded music is not considered a sound recording when included in a soundtrack on TV or film. This means that music used in a soundtrack in TV or film is not entitled to royalties. This affects me greatly because, for example, even though I played on most of every episode of CBC's Republic of Doyle, which is now syndicated worldwide, I only received the one-time union rate that I got per session, which was around $280, while the composer collects residuals every time the show airs. Now, in 44 countries around the world, the UK, France, and Australia among them, afford performers and record labels the right to receive public performance royalties when their sound recordings are used as a part of the soundtrack in TV and film. It's undeniable that the landscape has changed significantly, but artists are still creating, and we are asking for some accountability, that word again, from the government. We're asking for some redefining of who it is that they're protecting and fostering, and for the amendment of policies that date back to the late 1990s, policies that are now out of date. And if we need to adapt, then so do the policies that affect us. As multiple Juno Award winner and co-writer of many of Bryan Adams' biggest hits, Jim Vallance said, "We are self-employed entrepreneurs and proud professionals. We want a fair and legal marketplace for our music." So what got us here? What got us here is a culture of permissionless innovation. The tech race that asks the question, can we? And not the question, should we? What's missing is thought and care for consequences. Now, Sean Parker, one of the creators of Facebook, just reflected on his failure to think about the outcomes of his permissionless innovation and the monster that he created. He said, "I don't know if I really understood the consequences. God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains." And he's not the first person to recognize the dangers of permissionless innovation. So next year is another anniversary. It's the 200th anniversary of Frankenstein. Mary Shelley wrote this classic after witnessing the disastrous consequences of her industrial revolution. The moral of her story is that monsters are created when the only question being asked is, can I? We know what it's done to the livelihood of creators. It's produced the value gap, and that's our monster. Now, it would be irresponsible of me to be on a podium and not address another area where it seems the only question has been, can I, and not should I? What I'm talking about is being treated as revelatory, sensational news in the media. But to me, and every woman that I know, this is our lives. The root of this behavior is acting without regards to consequences and with no sense of accountability. In a word, it is permissionless, and it's society's monster, and we are all accountable for it. We should do better. We must do better. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Miranda, for that insightful discussion and for sharing the reality of this new landscape. Just a quick housekeeping item before I introduce the panelists. Those of you at the back, is it a little bit distracting with the light, or are we okay to continue without lowering the shades? It's okay? Okay, good stuff. Okay, so let's get things underway now and introduce our distinguished panelists to the stage. First, I'll introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Ms. Vashi Kapelos, Global Nationals Ottawa Bureau Chief and host of the West Block. Thank you very much, Vashi, for being here today. I'll welcome you to the stage. Next, I'd like to introduce a true fixture in Canadian film and television, Mr. Ari Posner. Thank you, Ari, for being here today. Our next panelist is a multi-platinum selling songwriter, public speaker, and author of the best-selling book, The Action Sandwich, a 6-step recipe to success by doing what you're doing already, Mr. Alan Few. Thank you for joining us today. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce a woman who is leading Access Copyright through a time of exciting transitions, Ms. Roanie Levy, President and CEO of Access Copyright. Welcome to the podium. I'll now turn the discussion over to Vashi. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be moderating this panel. I was saying to Roanie before that it's a subject that I'm interested in because it's one of the rare issues happening on Parliament Hill as we speak that Canadians, both consumers and creators, care about. It's always fun to do stories on things that people actually care about. So, so I wanted to get started by asking a simple question to all of you that maybe you could share your personal reflections on your story about. What does the value gap mean to you? And Ari, we'll start with you.
Well, I think for someone like me who is not a songwriter, but I am someone who works on the soundtracks for television and movies, so it's the music that you're not meant to notice. It's the behind-the-scenes stuff that sometimes might make you cry, and you know, or make you feel on the edge of your seat. You know, I'm part of a world that I think has only been moments behind the songwriting world in some ways, because what has happened with songwriting and streaming and the massive devaluation of that content has also begun happening, you know, because of the Netflix and the Hulus and the Amazon streaming services, which are undeniably great ways to enjoy entertainment. But there is a massive, massive difference in the way that they are valuing the music and the performances that are going on those networks. And I mean, literally, it could be as much as a 95 to 98% difference in how something would have paid an artist over time on terrestrial television versus how it is being now streamed on Netflix. So to me, that's a big part of what the value gap is.
It's a huge difference. Mm-hmm. And what about you, Alan?
Well, I have a confession to make. Regardless of the fact that I'm now 61 years of age, and the body's trying to tell me, like, I've got a bunion and I've got I've operated on my shoulder, I've had a stroke and all those things. I've never been as happy to be in that old paradigm that Stan spoke of, because I come from that school of ignorance. I really could have sat at that table and just listened to Stan and Miranda speaking, because I am the old school. I know how to write songs and I know how to cash checks. And I came from that place where a check really was a check. And so I just have stumbled through it all, depending on people like Stan and Miranda and Jim Valance, and in Glass Tiger's case, Sam Reed, because these people are advocates. So my thing would be to speak to young artists and tell them that, like, Miranda, that was brilliant, by the way. I mean, I would have flown here just to hear that, because I don't really know what I'll lend to this panel, you know. But so many musicians that I grew up with, we know nothing about these things, and we kind of stumble through. And then it's really ironic. I have my phone here, not because I want to share something with you. Give me 1 second. I have a good business sense, and I know how to cut deals, but I hate income tax, right? And I always find that this part of it's kind of like the income tax. But here's what I do know. I wrote a song called I Believe for the Olympics. I don't know if you guys... And that was a big copyright. And RBC and some other people are interested in bringing it back again. And I was dealing with some lawyers. And this I do know. I get this note right now, actually, just a few hours ago. And it says, by the way, there's no payment via SOCAN for music used in TV commercials / advertising in Canada. So the sync and master fee up front should reflect that there'd be no back-end royalties for TV use, which I didn't even know, right? So it causes me to write back and say, are you kidding me? Are you telling me that I'm not going to get paid the way I get paid? And that was only, what, 2010 with the Olympics. So this landscape is changing every minute of every day. So I'm kind of rambling here, and I'll pass on. But I need to tell these young songwriters that you got to pay attention. I promise you that I will. You can prod me and use me any way you want as an advocate, but I'm okay. I live in that paradigm of, see this, do you want it? You want to buy it off me? This is what it costs you. It costs you that much money to come in the door and see me play and buy a ticket. I know how to sell, I know how to create something for a dime and sell it for a buck. I know how to do that. But I would say to these young songwriters, you really have to pay attention to what you're hearing here today. That's very important.
Thanks, great point, Alan. And what about you, Roanie? How has the value gap affected you?
Thank you. Well, I don't come from the music world. I come from the writing and publishing world. And I run an organization called Access Copyright. And we represent authors, and I see some in the room, and publishers and visual artists whose works are reproduced. The value gap is just as real for writers as it is for a musician, but it comes from a different space, and it's been created in a different way. So I'm just going to take 2 minutes to give people that background so that they could understand the context and the challenge that writers are faced with. In 2012, there were some changes that were introduced to the Copyright Act, and as Miranda said, some were great and some really created more problems than they solved. And one of those problems that got created was, in fact, in the educational use of content. So if anybody's been to a university or have kids in university or in grade schools, they buy course packs, PDFs are uploaded on learning management system, kids come home with photocopies of textbooks because there are not enough textbooks for everyone. For years, for almost 30 years, those reproductions were paid for. And the authors would get paid when those copies were made. But in 2012, there was an introduction and an expansion of an amendment in the Copyright Act called Fair Dealing, and the word education was added. And so if the use was for education and the use was fair, then the person making the use no longer needed to ask for authorization or payment. When during the legislative process, creators and publishers said this is going to create a problem. It's, fairness is vague, it's in the eyes of the beholder, they're going to, this is a hole you could drive a truck through, they're going to stop paying, education is going to stop paying. And the educators and the representatives came to the legislative process as well and said, no, this is not about paying, we will continue to pay. This is just about greater access. We need greater access. A couple of weeks after the legislation came into force, they actually stopped paying. Initially, all of K-12 outside Quebec started paying, literally overnight. And then over the last 5 years, post-secondary stopped paying as well. So the vast majority of students in Canada today receive those reproductions for free under policies and practices, self-interpreted fairness guidelines from the education sector. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of copyright-protected pages. If you were to stack them up, they would be higher, they would dwarf Mount Everest. That's how many pages we're talking about. So we needed to get clarity from the courts about what fairness means, because obviously this was an unsustainable situation. Creators and publishers deeply believed that this kind of use was simply not fair. This summer, we got a decision from the federal court, and it was an unequivocal decision. The court said those practices are not fair. They're not fair in form, they're not fair in application. And in fact, I'm not going to read the whole 100-page decision, but I'm just going to read a couple of quotes. But it is a beautiful decision. I do recommend its reading. I'll read one quote. No, the judge didn't use the word value gap, but he might as well as. The judge says, the guidelines, so these are the copying policies and practices put in place by the education sector. The guidelines and their non-compliance results in the wealth transfer from copyright owners to educational institutions. That is a definition of a value gap. Someone is getting value, and it's the exchange of the value received is not given to the person who provided the value, the authors. The judge says any suggestion that the guidelines have not and will not have negative impacts on copyright owners or publishers is not tenable. There is no question that the evidence has established that on the matter of impacts in the fairness analysis, the plaintiff has made out its thesis completely. Just one last, but I'm telling you, there are lots of wonderful quotes. These are just excerpts, and it goes on for pages and pages like this. But it is evident that York created the guidelines and operated under them primarily to obtain for free that which they had previously paid for. One may legitimately ask how such, quote, works for free, unquote, could be fair if fairness encompasses more than one person's unilateral benefit. And that's the whole value gap and the exchange between those that are receiving value and those that are giving value. The impact of that decision on the ground has changed nada, nothing. The situation remains the same. The ministries of education are refusing to pay, the post-secondary institutions are refusing to pay, and they are appealing that decision. It is absolutely vital that this be addressed. We have seen publishers who have stopped their K-12 publication business completely, that have left the country, that have sold off, that have let employees go. Creators' income has dramatically dropped. Royalties from Access Copyright have dropped 80% since the use of these policies. And just to give you context of what that means, a writer, about 20% of a writer's income comes from the royalties from Access Copyright. So 20% is quite a lot. And when you consider that writers make on average $13,000 a year, that's a heck of a lot. December is the month where we send out the largest check to our writers. And for years, we would get these letters back about what it means to them to receive the royalty payment. And it could be a mortgage payment. It could be really important overdue dental work that they are finally able to afford. It could be winter tires that they now could buy for their car. It could be gifts they could buy for their kids. It is that kind of value and loss that they have suffered as a result of the education exception.
And for sure, I want to get to what you guys think the government's role is in all this. But before we do, just a quick note. We have about 10 minutes left for this panel, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So if you think of one and you jot it down, there is definitely an opportunity to ask those questions. I wanted to ask you, though, Ari, do you think the idea of an artist who can pursue their craft full-time is now long gone?
In my world of scoring, it's certainly become drastically less of a possibility, and I do get all kinds of people who come to talk to me and ask how can I get ahead and what are some of the next steps, and I know how to tell them about how to work on their craft, and I know how to tell them about networking and meeting some of the right people that are at the same stage and age as them, but I don't know what to tell them about the landscape of being able to make a viable living. I really do think, you know, getting back to some of what Miranda was saying, there's this huge area of middle class that is going to kind of disappear. It largely has in some ways. I mean, of course, you still have the top 5% that do this job, and it doesn't matter. They're still going to get the great gigs, and they're going to still see, you know, enough streams of their music on Netflix and on Amazon that it's going to be worthwhile for them. But you can lose. I mean, potentially we could lose a whole generation of Canadian talent that just is not going to be able to make a go of it. It's just going to be a hobby.
And Alan, what's the consequence of that on society?
I think listen to Yara there, it's just mimicking what's going on in the public sector. You know, it's the middle class is vanishing kind of a deal. I get young artists all the time asking me, you know, how to make it in this business, and I'm at a complete loss on where to begin. I was just talking to a young girl this morning about coming here, and she was that's the question she was asking. So again, I think that there's a sort of moral and professional obligation for artists like myself who are still within that category of being able to. I have a really good touring life, and I still do extremely well. I do notice that I've always noticed that, you know, there's the whales and the sharks and the seals and the fish and the sardines and the plankton, and they sort of feed on us. I've known that. And the other thing for a young artist who plan on making it or got a dream of making it, you forget the other. Here we are, we're talking about the direct royalty, but you know, I come from that world. I've always known about managers and agents and publicists and the government, and so you're constantly, you know, every dollar's getting hit. And I'm not stupid. I realize now that a check that used to have 100% value to me is probably, you know, 20% of what it was, 10%. So I'm just thinking that artists that are still in the position I'm in, we have a sort of professional and moral obligation to join the quest and speak up on behalf of these young artists.
I just want to add to that like if you're thinking about the impact that it has on as the consumer, you know, I mean, I don't think we want to be living in a world where it's only the Drakes and only the, you know, the Taylor Swifts or the whoever it is that are able to rise to the top. And that's what's being fed to us on YouTube and the likes of. I mean, imagine if you know, Joni Mitchell, for example, couldn't get there because that's what's, you know, rising to the top based on simply on business. It's kind of a scary thing. So you know, I just want people to sort of think about that as we're up here sort of saying our work needs to be valued more. It's vital to the consumer that it be valued more so that the choices are there.
From the writing and publishing world, it's about using Canadian content in our classroom, about not using American textbooks and actually having a vibrant writing and publishing sector, so we have the content that we need in our classroom, and we're already seeing the impact of this value gap.
And before we get to audience questions, I'll start with you, Roanie. Where does the government fit in all this? So you obviously heard from Miranda about the copyright law review that's going on right now. What are some tangible things that you hope to see come out of that review?
You know, there are solutions. What we haven't seen now is a willingness to actually go through the hard parts and put those solutions in place. We need to put the creator at the heart of the Copyright Act. The creator has nowhere else to find itself if it's not at the heart of the Copyright Act. So that needs to be the lens by which we conduct the review. And then we need to have the courage to actually make the changes that are necessary.
Ari?
Yes, I 100% agree with that, we need to have a voice at the table, and it needs to happen fast. Like it needs to happen faster than it has happened, because as we all know, technology is just moved so fast that I mean, nobody can really keep up with it. And I mean, I just kind of visualize it like that. There's all this carnage at the side of the road, and technology will do what it does, but it's government's responsibility to be on top of it as much as they can and intervene. You know.
And Alan, what's your level of faith that can actually happen? I mean, governments have a lot. They have a lot on their plate.
You would ask me that.
And government doesn't exactly, you say, move fast. It's not always the case. So I guess, what's your level of optimism?
Well, it's like any other great movement. It's one voice at a time, one by one, you know, one step at a time. He walks far, right, after taking that one step at a time. So my level of faith would be sort of equal to the level of faith that I have that people like Miranda and Stan and these advocates that are willing to step up to the plate on behalf of us, as long as there's enough of us raise our voices. What are we asking? We're asking for fairness. If you guys are familiar with Lefsetz, do anybody know about Bob Lefsetz? He's probably the premier music artistic blogger on the planet right now. And I fell prey to he'll go out and he'll say, "Oh, get over it, you old cynical fogies that expecting it to be like it was. This is a new landscape, get over it." And I kind of fell prey to that, but I realize here today that the landscape doesn't have to be like that. You know, it's about fairness.
Great point. So we can take some audience questions now. There's a microphone right there. If there's somebody who would like to ask a question, head on up. Absolutely. Just identify yourself before.
Yes, I'm Pierre Nattel. I'm the heritage critic for the NDP. I want to commend Music Canada and SOCAN for organizing this and the Economic Club to host the topic. I think it's so important. I think that, Miranda, you were simply astounding, and I think that everybody would agree that if we get to have a video recording of your speech, we'd all be happy to re-sit there and re-listen, because this has to be shared with so many people, especially the audience and the music fans. You deserve this huge applause.
Absolutely. Hear, hear.
And if we're talking about steps, I'm a big fan of your old songs. Really, man. Someday was my favorite. And so really, what I want to say is that if we're talking about small steps, we can recognize that Mélanie Joly's reform includes something about the copyright board and the copyright review. So this is promising. I think that we all recognize that the latest decisions of the Commission board was terrible. So we hope this is going to be renewed. But on the other hand, I must say that I think that how do you say that? The cat is out of the bag when Mélanie Joly went and say in about 3 weeks ago that internet suppliers should bring in some money to a cultural fund. And then she obviously has been shut down. She said it. She may not have wanted to say it because it's something that's going to add 5% to an internet bill of all Canadians. Well, 5% of a $50 bill, according to my calculations, is $2.50. And if it makes a huge difference, because let me remind you that in mid-90s, we had the Fonds des médias du Canada, the Canadian Media Fund, and the cable companies have been asked to put aside 5% of their billing so that we can have Canadian stories on these screens. Why? Because these cable providers were bringing the world to us, which is great, and we all love Google, we all use it all the time. So why not apply the same methodology to internet suppliers? Because they're the same companies, by the way, and like you say, Miranda, you are subsidizing Bell radio stations. So they wear many hats, just like you, not as stylish for sure, but they do wear many hats, and this specific hat is the hat where they're making money. If you're watching a Gordani captation show in the middle of a desert in Marrakesh, there's an internet service provider who actually has a subscription with you. And why on earth cannot we have some policies to protect our own creators with the money of the consumption that we are making? And let's not blame anyone. But like you say, the first step is there. I think that we should command Mélanie Joly to talk about the Commission. the Copyright Commission, but I think the internet service providers is something that she had to admit. Maybe you didn't see that, but it's printed. And she's been shut down. This has to be pushed up as an issue. Thank you. Thank you. We have to go to question period.
I'm terrified. Okay. Hi, okay, I've got a question. A big issue taking place in the US, which will stand off to vote next month, is the debate over net neutrality. If the ISPs get their way, it will shake the world, seeing as many of the big internet services are based in the US. That's, you know, like YouTube and Apple Music. Do you think that the streaming revenue for artists will drastically change if net neutrality dies? Say, if an ISP that has a geographical monopoly partners with one streaming service in particular?
That's above my pay scale.
Anybody want to weigh in?
I don't know if I can directly answer that question, but I think that what you're getting at is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is that there are essentially 5 big tech companies that are running the show right now, and it's not terribly different from what was going on in the late 1800s when there was the steel companies and the railroads that were literally forming these big conglomerations and forcing prices or fixed prices and making for a very unfair marketplace. And at that time, the government did what they had to do and stepped in and took it apart. And I do feel like we're at a stage now where we're really close to some kind of reckoning like that has to happen with these companies. Now, it doesn't really answer your question. Will it change?
If AT&T ends up preferring Spotify, do you think they'll change the ratings for like the percentage of cents that artists get on Spotify?
I wish I could answer. I wish I could answer that in a like. Who can predict that? But
I don't know. I just wanted your thoughts.
Well, I do think that if these large conglomerates are made to either be broken up or to act more justly, those rates will come up. They have to. How long will that take is the question.
And does the government have the will to do that?
Do they have the will, political will? It's a very good question. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your question.
I think there's a deeper issue here, which is the climate that we're now living in. I think we live in a world where people want Uber cabs because they're cheaper, they're easier. Everybody wants a $200 big screen TV because it's cheaper, it's easier, and nobody thinks about the person, the slave who's making the TV. And so people they've realized that they can get everything for free. I have friends in the music business who will say, yeah, I downloaded a movie for free. And I say, well, why won't you pay for it? Because there's a makeup artist, there's a cinematographer, there's a best boy, there's a key grip, and they're not going to get paid. The artist at the top will get paid, the big star will get paid, and the company will get paid. But the people in the middle who actually make their living out of doing this will not get paid. And that's somebody who's actually in the music business. I think there needs to be an education of the public of every time what happens when you download a song, when you take a song for free. What are you doing to that artist that you love? What are you doing to them when instead of giving them 99 cents for a song on iTunes, you just get it for free, or you do file sharing and stuff? I think there needs to be a broader education of the public. I think, yeah, the government and industry has to be involved, but if the consumer isn't involved as well, I think I don't know what the point would be, because of it's the world we live in now. So
I think you make an excellent point. I think the allure of free, the attraction of free, catches all of us in its net, and we never truly stop to think about what the true cost is of free. Education should start in the classroom as well. And one of the, I think, unintended consequences of the copying practices of the education sector without compensating the writers is that we're actually right from the beginning educating our students that they can just make reproductions of whatever they want for free. and that will have cost beyond the loss of our writing and publishing sector.
Jim Valance and I used to sit and chat about that kind of stuff, and this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but he used to always say that we should have stopped a long time ago telling people that we play. What do you do? What do you do? Oh, I play music. Because psychologically, I think people think that that's what we do. To this day, my manager will get a call and they'll say, "Will Alan come and do such and such?" And he'll put a fee to it, and it'll be, "Oh, no, there's no money involved, but he'll have a really good time." You know, it'll be great. He'll have a lot of fun, and he'll get his dinner, and you know. So maybe we should stop. You know, this new generation is coming up. Don't tell people you play. Just tell them you work.
We have time, I think, just for one really, really fast last question.
Oh, sure. It's, I guess, a question to the whole room, I suppose. But I've been listening to all these great conversations and thinking to myself, you know, if music is treated as a commodity or as an industry, I wonder if anyone can think of any examples of other commodity industries where there was a massive disruption and through policy and work there was a remedy to that disruption, and what was the strategy behind that? If anyone can think of an example of another commodity that suffered a similar disruption. And yeah.
Yeah, I've also been thinking about that a lot lately. I don't know if I can speak of a specific commodity, but you can certainly, you don't have to look far to look at the Uber was just mentioned here. You think of the taxi drivers that have been, you know, vastly affected. My understanding is in London they've intervened there and to regulate that. But they haven't done that in other cities, and I don't know why that is. But again, it's, you know, it's happening to travel. We'll say again. Journalism. It's happening to travel agencies. It's happening to. I think it's going to happen to real estate agents and to truck drivers soon enough. You know, it's a much bigger problem. I don't know how many places I can say, and here's a solution. You know, where the government.
But isn't there a little difference between, like, if I'm the cab company, and Uber comes along and they're basically doing the same thing, a little cheaper. That to me doesn't sound like someone saying, "No, here's what you have to do. You have to drive my cab for me, and I give you nothing. I'm not giving you anything for it." There's a big difference there.
I think, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much for all your comments and for your questions. They were great questions and great answers, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Graham Henderson. I'm the president of, by Gord, Colin. No. It's just, it always happens. And Deegan, too. So I'm the president and CEO of Music Canada, and we're proud to co-sponsor this event with our friends at SOCAN. We do so because we are truly in awe of Miranda's advocacy, and we believe that decision makers in Ottawa, all of whom have left the room, need to hear her message. But the fact is they were here and they did hear it. Miranda is in many ways the perfect spokesperson for modern creators because she's a multi-talented artist entrepreneur who is constantly adapting her business model to keep up with the digital marketplace, just like so many of her peers. What you may not know is that Miranda's message is penetrating the community. The more people who hear her speak, it's really quite remarkable how they rally behind her. Mr. Nantel alluded to the problems that we have with the Copyright Board. That actually affects the livelihood of musicians. Miranda saw that, reached out, and within almost no time had 100 artist signatures on a letter to Ministers Baines and Joly and the Prime Minister pointing at the problems with the Copyright Board. And artist advocates around the world are also recognizing, taking notice of Miranda's work. I can think, for example, these names may not mean anything, but they are big in the artist advocacy community. Blake Morgan and Maria Schneider in the United States, David Lowery as well from Cracker, Zoe Keating, a Canadian. But there is a community of them. And Miranda is joining the ranks of the leading sort of artist advocates in the world. At Music Canada, we were so impressed with what she was doing. We have a sort of an annual general meeting every year, and we decided that, well, we're going to actually create an award category, which we've called Artist Advocacy Award, which we're going to try to give out every year to an artist who is leading advocacy. Doesn't have to actually even be in music, but we created almost around what Miranda was doing. So to Miranda, thank you for your honesty and your passion, your dedication to bringing real change. And, you know, some of the questions that were asked, you know, one of them was about consumers. I find it amazing just how much she's anticipated this. I mean, this little forum, it's what artists can do. It's what industry members can do. It's what consumers can do. It's quite extraordinary the degree to which she has thought through how we can all take concrete actions, every one of us in this room, to make change. You know, music fans, the music industry, artists, we all have been struggling to adapt our practices, our listening habits, our business models, and we've been doing this for 20 years. And I'm just going to leave on this note. There is a category here for the government, what the government can do, and the question was asked, you know, can the government do anything? Are there any? The government broke up the goddamn railroads. Right? There are tons of examples. Miranda hit on a very important point. These technology companies want a permissionless environment. That is antithetical to social democracy. Social democracies are founded on rules and regulations that benefit society at large, and yes, you do have to ask permission. Whether you're a member of the tech bros or you're Harvey Weinstein, you have to ask permission. So for government, I think the message here is you need to now step up. The world these artists live in, that Roanie's writers live in, was created by government in many respects. And Alan, I took your point, like it doesn't have to be that way. We have been sold the idea that this is just the way it is. Bob Lefsetz, get used to it. Social democracies do not have to get used to it. We get to make choices. And, you know, we did an economic analysis of the amount. Just remember, the money, there is money. The value gap is built on the idea that there is music is more valuable, writing is more valuable than it has ever been before. And in Canada, if music had simply kept pace with inflation and GDP after 1999, if that's all that happened, which is a very, very conservative assumption to make, we had a renowned economist calculate what the value gap was. If that's all it had done, just dink along at that rate up until now, how much more money would there be in the pockets of creators? And in music alone, it's $12 billion. But it didn't just disappear. Somebody has that. And it's in the form of subsidies, whether it's subsidies like Roanie talked about or subsidies like Miranda talked about, it's in other people's pockets and it's wrong. And what we're missing is a sense of urgency. And I'm glad, Miranda, that you brought up the 5-year anniversary, because that committee that was supposed to consider that act should have been identified or impaneled 2 weeks ago, and we hear nothing but crickets. We need a sense of urgency. So Miranda, thank you for bringing that sense of urgency. Thank you for the panel, too, for bringing a real sense of urgency to this room. And I hope that you all will take the sense of urgency out into the world with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.